when I first started to realize that there was a serious problem
Hmm.
was when Trump announced that he was running. And all of a sudden, there in central Pennsylvania, Confederate flags started popping up like weeds
Hmm.
everywhere. So this is Pennsylvania. This is not the South.
Hi, this is Frank Schaeffer, and you are listening to and or watching my podcast, In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. This is a Facebook Live event first, then is reposted on Facebook, and its recorded version goes to YouTube and to a number of places after that where podcasts are found. My producer, Ernie Gregg, and I book different people. This particular person is a friend of his, and that is Reverend Dr. Leah. Say your last name.
Schade.
Schade. Okay. I asked Leah her first name, and then now I'm checking on the last one. In any case, Leah is an author and an associate professor of preaching and worship at Lexington Theological Seminary. Leah is the author of Preaching in the Purple Zone, Ministry in the Red-Blue Divide, and I think, am I accurate in saying more recently, Creation Crisis, Preaching, Ecology, Theology, and the Pulpit. Is that right? Was that the most recent book?
Actually, Creation Crisis Preaching was first,
Oh,
and
okay.
then Preaching in the Purple Zone, and then a couple more after that. So
Great.
yeah,
So we have everything in the wrong order. That's perfect.
that's all right. It's all there.
Yeah. I grew up dyslexic. So I think, Ernie, if you're listening, let's rename our podcast, because we've had so many flubs like that I produce all by myself. And let's just call it, Dyslexics Are Now or something like that, or whatever, because I always reverse everything. And you notice I asked you how to pronounce your name off air, and then you came back on, and I'm so insecure about all that, I had to ask you how to pronounce your
Well, at least you're asking. Some people don't even ask. So
well, the
appreciate
thing
that
is,
courtesy.
Schade is easy. The first part's good for me because SCH is the way you start Schaeffer. So at least I got that part right. I knew it was
Yes.
a sound. And by the way, what kind of name is that? Is that also a German name?
It is. It's my married name, and the German pronunciation would be Schade, which means what a pity.
Yeah, like
So
Schadenfreude, right?
exactly.
Okay.
So, but we go with the Americanized pronunciation. So
Mhm.
shade, like tree shade.
Okay. And you got nice books behind you. These days, you often wonder if that's the real background or somebody,
Oh,
they
it's
have all
real.
this
That's my office.
No, I
Yes.
can tell because the other stuff doesn't fool me. And this is my real background here. Where are you sitting right now, other than being
I
in the
am
office?
sitting at my office at Lexington Theological Seminary.
And where is that?
That is in Lexington, Kentucky.
Okay. And you have been there for a while?
I'm in my 7th year.
Okay. And before that?
I was a pastor. I pastored 3 different churches over the course of my ministerial career, and all in Pennsylvania. And one was a suburban church
Mm.
in Media, Reformation Lutheran Church. The second one was Spirit and Truth Worship Center, which was another part of Philadelphia, an African American congregation. And then I served United in Christ Lutheran Church
Hmm.
in central Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
So all very different ministry contexts, and they taught me a lot about doing ministry in the purple zone and talking about environmental issues and all kinds of other
Hmm.
social issues.
And has this all been with the Lutherans?
Yes, I'm ordained in the ELCA.
Hmm.
And so, yes, all of my work has been there. Although, I mean, I guess preach at all kinds of churches. So,
And you still preach, or are
uh,
you just not serving as a minister somewhere? You're teaching now?
my full-time job is teaching and writing, and so I just guest preach now.
Now, you mentioned your married name is Schade. What is your background? That Schade's a German name. Where are your people from?
My people are Scots-Irish
Hmm.
and German.
Okay, well, very similar to me.
Hmm.
Schaeffer on one side, and then Scotch British on the other side. So close.
And my maiden name is Jacobs.
Okay, not a German name.
Well, right. So
It could be Jakob, I guess, but
yeah. I mean, there's probably some
some German. Yeah,
Jewishness in my background,
yeah.
but I haven't traced the family tree back that far. So
Well,
so yeah.
since we got a little bit on the family thing, I ask people for their backgrounds before we get into the career oriented or the intellectual stuff. If somebody asked me, what do you do for a living? 30 years ago, I would have said I'm a writer and talked about some of my books. These days, I've seen through career definitions of people. I want to know who they really are. And in my case, who I really am is the grandfather of 5 grandchildren. 3 are grown, 3 are younger. I do childcare for them in the afternoons. I'll be picking Nora up after we do this. She's now 8. I've already got her snack ready and cooked in the other room. And that's me. That's what I actually care about. And that's how I define myself as a caregiver that's take care of my grandchildren right now.
That's beautiful.
Not as a writer or any of those other things, and or, my wife, Jeannie's companion. So how do you define yourself, not for the bio on a book, but where do you live in your own mind in terms of what's important to you? And you don't have to come up with a touchy-feely moment like I just did. This isn't Oprah. You can just say, it's all about the stock market and hoarding gold. I don't care. We love you anyway. Typical preacher stuff like that. What do you do?
The people that I care about are my husband, Jim, and he is a drummer, a jazz musician, a teacher, and we have 2 kids. My daughter Rachel is a student at Berea College.
Okay, I know Berea.
Yeah, and my son Ben is a sophomore in high school. Both of them are percussionists, just like their dad, and it's marching band season. And so if you know anything about marching band parents,
I know something about marching bands.
It's all about marching band for about the next month.
So, hey, what is she studying at Berea?
She is a double major in communication and music performance.
Oh, that's great. So the music part stuck now. Is she also a percussionist, or has she got other instruments as well?
She is a percussionist. She also plays piano.
Good for her.
And so my husband's a percussionist. I am a harpist and a pianist. And so music it's in the DNA. So that's another thing that defines me. That's what I care about. I teach harp and piano and play gigs, that sort of thing. And the other thing that it really defines me is I love to be in God's creation. I love doing my garden. I love going for hikes. I love walking. I love sitting under trees or in trees. That has been a huge part of who I am, who I understand myself to be.
Speaking of which, when I can see the bookshelves behind you, are you in a rural community? Are you in a town? Where's your house located? I don't mean your address, but where do you look out your window?
So we live in Lexington, and Lexington is in the bluegrass, central Kentucky area.
Sure, I know where it is. Yeah.
Yeah, and so we have a garden in the backyard. We have beautiful trees around, but it's an urban area.
Sure.
And I love Lexington. It's a great place to live. Culturally, it's very rich, and we're very close to the Daniel Boone National Forest. It's not a far drive, so we can go hiking.
Yes.
And just Lexington has fantastic parks, a great park system. So we spent a lot of time walking in parks.
Yeah. When you mentioned your husband teaches, is he teaching music, and if so, all percussion or other things as well? And what's the context of his teaching?
Yeah, he teaches drums and percussion. So he has a private studio, and he teaches for the school district, and he's got students from kids all the way to older adults. And it's just I just think it's wonderful when older adults decide that they want to pick up a musical instrument, and especially the drums. And so it's really cool. So yeah, he's got any gigs. He plays.
Sure.
Lexington has a great music scene. it was hurt bad by the pandemic,
Yeah, of
and it's
course.
starting to come back, not as much as we would like, but he's very active. Has he's been on the Philly music scene, he's been in the DC music scene, and and then Central Pennsylvania, and now here in Lexington.
Oh, that's great. So now when he plays, is he playing on things that get recorded as a session musician sometimes, like up in Philadelphia where he did things, or is it all live performance, or was before COVID or whatever?
Most of his recordings were done when he was in Philadelphia. He's got some recordings. My favorite one is "It Might As Well Be Spring" with Larry McKenna,
Oh, great.
a saxophone player.
Sure.
But he's been on lots of different recordings and radio shows, that sort of thing. But now that since we've been in Kentucky, most of his work has been live gigs and teaching.
Yeah. So over the years, when you were in ministry yourself as a minister, not as a teacher who then also preaches, was he kind of holding the fort on income for a while, or were you always pulling a paycheck? Because you don't sound like you were in the big end of the book, the mammoth God business. You sound too legitimate to have had your own television show or something. So how'd you put it all together over the years?
Yeah, it was a lot of patchwork quilting things together. It's very difficult to make a living as a pastor and as a musician.
Yeah.
And so I'll just say there were some very lean years. And but we managed to get through, and here we are.
Yeah, well, it depends what kind of pastor. There are some famous names out there that seem to be doing okay. I think maybe a pastor who actually preaches Christianity would be the definition of when it's harder to make money than if you're running a personality cult or something like that. That seems to be where the big bucks are.
Well, that would feel really disingenuous to me.
Yes.
And I couldn't live with myself if I were profiting
right
off of ministry.
Well, if you ever want to know how to do it, I was there in the 70s and 80s when the explosion of the big time religious right happened, and I left it, but I still remember how to do that. So if you have a change of heart and you ever want to jump into that market,
that's okay.
You may not have your husband and children with you, but then, those guys all just sort of do what they got to do anyway. So
yeah.
So I'm gathering that with that picture of Donald Trump in the Oval Office with all the Christian leaders like Paula White and Ralph Reed and people gathered around him. You weren't in that photograph?
Oh my goodness, that gives me the heebie-jeebies.
Okay.
I have been very concerned about white Christian nationalism, Christofascism.
Yeah.
I head up an organization called the Clergy Emergency League, and it's a network of clergy who are really concerned about the unholy matrimony between Christianity in its most extreme sense,
sure,
and the political far right. And so we're doing a lot to try to equip pastors for how to talk about this in their congregations.
Yeah.
How to think of, how do you talk about social issues in politically divided congregations?
Yeah.
How do you deal with the disinformation, the misinformation? That's been a huge concern for us, especially over the last 3 years.
Yeah, I'm not very good at math, but just from what you said earlier, if I got this right, you would have actually been a minister in a church during part of the Trump era, would you not?
I left just before the election and started teaching here.
So my guess is that you had people you were connected with who were riding that out, and which brings me to a question, and I'm sorry I just interrupted you, but I wanted to make sure that I get this before I forget it. Have you got people within the Lutheran community or those in family members or other associations that you were sort of already part of that have kind of surprised you by going in that direction, voting for Trump, becoming part of the MAGA thing? Have you found yourself in that situation, or, is your circle, more progressive to the point where you don't even know anybody or personally connect with people like that?
When I first started to realize that there was a serious problem was when Trump announced that he was running. And all of a sudden, there in central Pennsylvania, Confederate flags started popping up like weeds
Hmm.
everywhere. So this is Pennsylvania. This is not the South.
Yeah.
And if I had stayed there and continued my ministry, what I really wanted to do was a sociological study of what's going on here. Why
Hmm.
are all of these Confederate flags popping up?
Hmm.
And that's when I started to that and the other thing that concerned me at the time, but now looking back, I realized just how horrible it was, were the the hunting clubs and the gun clubs
Hmm.
that are all around rural Pennsylvania.
Hmm.
That from our house where we lived in the last place that I served, you could hear rounds of guns going off. And you're like, what? Like they were doing military training exercises. And I
Yeah.
remember having conversations with my husband and some other people saying, these people are actually preparing for something.
Hmm.
And we better hope that it doesn't go the way that they think it's going to go, because we're in big trouble. And here we are 6 years later,
Yeah.
and this is exactly what I was concerned about, is what's happening.
Yeah. I mean, post storming of the Capitol and on and on and on.
Yep.
Let me just reintroduce you a second here. You're watching and or listening to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, which is my podcast. And today we are with Leah Schade, and she's a pastor and a teacher, an author, and an author of many books. And by the way, Leah, we're going to link to everything so that you don't have to remember to tell people how to get to your books, because we'll put everything wherever this shows up. There'll be links to everything.
Wonderful. Thanks.
And how to reach you or anything else you want people to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so forth and so on. Let me get back to the Confederate flags popping up everywhere. What was your observation at the time? And then in hindsight, and obviously that would be a whole discussion here, but how would you answer the questions you were asking yourself when you first started seeing this and hearing the groups training in the woods or whatever, as to why is this happening in Pennsylvania, which is not the deep South or typical of what you would think of there? Hey, this is Pennsylvania, where there are also a bunch of Amish people running around in horse carts, and the Liberty Bell is there, the whole bit. This isn't the South. So how did you explain that to yourself or to your kids? Or what are the conclusions you've drawn since as to why that was popping up in that state in particular, in a kind of an imitation of what you would think of more in the South? What was going on?
Yeah, well, it was the rise of the white grievance culture and the militarization of it. That area of Pennsylvania was hard hit in the 80s and 90s by industries leaving, and by some waves of immigrants coming in, and there's a lot of xenophobia. There's a lot of fear of the other. I can speak to this because I come from the Pennsylvania Dutch. Those are my people.
Sure.
And Pennsylvania Dutch, they're hard workers. They are, they keep to themselves, very family oriented. But there's a deep suspicion of anybody who's considered an outsider. So when you see things that are happening, it's very easy to blame others and not make the connection between what's happening at a global and corporate and capitalistic level. It's much easier to say, well, it's because of those black and brown skinned people that I don't have my job, and that crime is going up, and that drugs are coming in, and all of this. Like, it's really easy to go there and to blame victims of the same problems that they're dealing with. And so I saw it as a very easy way for Trump, and then what followed, to weaponize white grievance, and to empower that kind of thinking, and being able to say the racial slurs and the ethnic slurs and fly the flag. All of a sudden, that what was seething inside but was beneath the surface, that we thought had gone away in this country. It really had just gone underground. And so the Trumpism allowed, like, it just barely scratched the
Yeah.
surface, and then boom, all of this starts erupting.
I have a question for you from that, kind of Pennsylvania Dutch, hardworking, Northern European background of yours, and then the part of the country you're living in. Let me see how to put this correctly, or as best I can. One of the things that surprised me about Trump is not the rise of Trumpism as you describe it, because what you've just said makes perfect sense. But it's that I remember my grandmother, who died in her 90s in the 1970s, and I remember her being this sort of German British working class woman whose husband had a third grade education and so forth. But my grandmother, people like her, the folks in my neighborhood right here in Massachusetts, some of whom have flown Trump flags and other things. There's one thing I normally used to say about that group, and that is they were, maybe they were closet racists. Maybe they wanted to break out that Confederate flag somewhere. But I'll tell you what they didn't used to be. They were not suckers for con artists.
Ooh, wow.
They were hard-edged people. I mean, if you had tried to pull some kind of shit with my grandmother, invest in this, do that, the usual thing. This was not some doddering old fool. She was a smart cookie. And, when I think of the working guys that I know here in my neighborhood, a guy that makes steel sculptures and puts them on his lawn and flew his flag upside down when Obama was elected and put a Trump sign on his line. If you talk to him and tried to sell him something, and by the way, he's a friend of mine. He does some things for me. He would never come off as a sucker for, try to sell him a used car that leaks oil. Do you know what I'm saying? Try to sell him a piece of swamp in Florida. This is not that kind of thing. So now that's a long-winded way of saying, what do you think happened to not turn these folks into closet racists? Because there's a good explanation of that. And this has nothing to do with the jobs going away and the Rust Belt and so forth. Why all of a sudden are all these hard-nosed working people, white males, who would look really carefully at a car if you were trying to sell them one, their wives who are not going to be suckered by stuff, clipping coupons, taking care of business? Why has this class of people been so easy to hoodwink by, for instance, just take one aspect of the Trump family, raising hundreds of millions of dollars from them and then spending it on their own family and not putting it into any of the legal defense funds they said they were, but just outright thievery? And the whole history of Trump and his family with Trump University and all the rest of it. These, aside from the politics and the hate, these are con artists, real con artists, professional con artists. That's all they've ever done.
Yes.
Why did this group of savvy, working, white, working class people and their evangelical cohorts, forget the racism, why did they fall for a con artist like this and follow him all the way down the rabbit hole and are still sending him money?
Yeah. I would say there are two, I would want to say two things about that. First of all, they might be savvy about some things, but there are other ways in which I think they have been suckered in the past.
Yeah.
And I think it is regarding the modus operandi of evangelicals.
Yeah.
I have had a relative, she has since died, who would constantly give money to the televangelists.
Sure.
And bought it hook, line, and sinker that if she gave her money, that they were going to pray for her and she was going to be successful. And I mean, I don't even know how many thousands of dollars that this single lower middle class woman gave and just totally bought into it. So there is I know it's not good to use the word brainwash, but I don't know what other term to use. They've already been acculturated. They've already, that Pavlovian response that if you give your money, you will get this.
Yeah.
And I think the Trump team figured out a way to ring that Pavlovian bell. If you give money, you're going to save this country, So I think that's part of it. But the other part of it is, there's a great book by Heather McGhee called The Sum of Us. And she does this just fine-grained analysis of how white folks have been conditioned and hoodwinked into voting against their own best interests
Mhm.
in order to keep people of color from accessing the common good.
Hmm.
So she's got this whole thing about what happened with swimming pools when desegregation happened. Community pools used to be huge in this country. They were great social gathering places.
Hmm.
And there were communities that filled in the pools, got rid of them, and took away this wonderful thing just so that they wouldn't have to share it with the blacks.
Yeah.
Well, that's being hoodwinked. You've been hoodwinked by a story, by a narrative that's saying that there is a zero-sum game here, that if we share, if you share with people who are different in some way than you, there will be less for you. And that kind of that zero-sum narrative it's extremely toxic, but it's extremely effective. And I think that has hoodwinked people as well.
Yeah, good points. Now I'm going to come back to something that Ernie, my producer, just texted me here because it's a really good point. So I won't forget this one because it's right there. And how does this factor into your version of the purple zone, which is one of your books? So that's a great segue into that. But before I go there, I'm going to double back on what you were saying and just say, I have observed with the evangelical community and comment on a fact similar to what you just said, that if you were designing a childhood to prepare you to believe the gospel of fake news,
yes,
and being hoodwinked by fundraisers, nothing serves better than the evangelical / fundamentalist white church, because there you are used to pastors who often become demigods and do pretty much what they want, and whose word is law, especially in a patriarchal context of the male in charge of the females and the children and so forth. You get used to giving money to very dubious characters in terms of televangelists and others who self-evidently aren't doing what they said. And because of my background on the religious right, I knew all these guys personally. By the way, the people who she was sending these donations to, I'm sure I knew all of them or were on their shows at some point, sadly. But then the other thing is this kind of opposition to the world, where you grow up in a home telling you that, trust the Bible, not science. Universities are dubious places because they'll take you away from the Lord. Believe what your preacher's telling you, not what the textbook says, and so forth. You put those things together, those two things together, and you have prepared a group of people to always feel first like victims being taken advantage of by the world. A guy comes along and says, you're a victim, and preaches the same thing they're hearing in church, but on a political front of like, it's us against them. You're primed for this, and you're used to sending people money. Just comment on that, and then let's get to your book, The Purple Zone.
Yes, the other thing, everything that you're saying, I definitely resonate with. And what I'll add is the phenomenon of apocalypticism.
Yes.
And the eschatological fear that has been drummed into, and I have family members who are evangelical, and I have vivid memories of, as a child, being taken to one of these, to a church where I was told, we're going to go watch a movie at church. And I was like, oh, how cool. We're going to get to watch a movie at church. Well, it turned out to be one of these horrific movies in the 70s where they showed the Antichrist and the mark of the beast, and children being murdered because, it was awful. I was so traumatized by this. I can't believe I'm still a Christian.
Yeah.
We left this, and my family members said, well, what did you think of the movie? And what do you think about Jesus coming back? And I was like, I'm really scared about Jesus coming back now. And they said, well, you should be.
Yeah.
So that fear, it is a fear-based theology. Yeah. And another book that I worked on with our New Testament professor here at the seminary is called Apocalypse When, and how do we deal with reading and interpreting and preaching apocalyptic texts. And so we spent a lot of time just unpacking the metaphorical language and the mythology. What did it mean then? What does it mean now? How do
Right.
we deconstruct this? But this is really hard. Like, if this is what has been drummed into you from the time you are a child, and then you have a political figure that comes along and says, I am the anointed one. I mean, like, there were people saying about Trump, he is the Messiah. There's like
Well,
a
they still
track
are.
now,
They're
right?
saying
They
he couldn't
still
have,
are.
they
He's the
couldn't have lost.
Messiah.
Yeah, and he
Yeah.
couldn't have lost the election because he's a God's anointed. So obviously he won.
Exactly. Right, right.
Yeah.
So when you are giving money to that, when you are supporting that fusion of religion and this very toxic political climate,
Right.
it makes for a very dangerous combination.
So now let's get to Ernie's good question that he sent me. And that's why Ernie, by the way, gets the big bucks. He's like, okay, and he'll be weeping at that somewhere as he watches this. The Purple Zone. Tell us about that book.
When I was in preaching, in ministry full time,
Yeah.
and I was thinking about how do we help congregations talk about social issues, I wanted to find a way to bridge divides. And I was introduced to a method of civil discourse called deliberative dialogue, which was created by the Kettering Foundation. And I developed a method of preaching called the sermon dialogue sermon method, where a pastor would preach a sermon that introduces a congregation to a topic, whether it's, the climate crisis or gun violence or food insecurity, whatever it is, not in a way that is, John the Baptist, you're all going to, repent,
Sure.
or, but in an invitational way to say, look, the Bible speaks about difficult issues, political issues of its time. So we are authorized and actually compelled to do the same. But I want to do this in a way that is a dialogue. So it's not just the pastor in a monologue saying, this is what you must believe. Let's have a constructive dialogue about this.
Sure.
And then there is an actual dialogue.
Yeah.
After the service. It doesn't take place during the service. And then out of that is the and I'll talk about deliberative dialogue in a minute, but the follow-up sermon draws on the insights from the group that had this discussion to say, okay, here's what we learned, and here's where we think God might be calling us to move forward on this issue. So it's not just I preach this prophetic sermon and I'm done. It's much more of a homiletical accompaniment to help a congregation metabolize these difficult conversations over time so that we get away from fight or flight, but actually into constructive engagement.
And how does that in some way impact what we were talking about before, or doesn't it?
It does. So I've been I've done some grant work with this and tested this method with congregations in the Disciples of Christ denomination, in the United Methodist Church denomination. And so I've got data from surveys for pastors and congregations. And what we found is that when congregations learn how to engage constructively, when pastors are trained on how to do this, the conflict, first of all, becomes normalized in the sense that we know how to talk about these difficult things without hurting each other. And so we find that congregations are more willing to engage in civil discourse and social action over the long term. And it also helps with just the ability of the congregation as a unit to be better decision makers, and then for their members to be better at democracy because they learned how to have better conversations right here in their own church. So like I said, we've been testing it. I'm very excited about the kind of work we've been doing. And that's been a lot of what I've been concentrating on the last 4 years.
Back in 1972, my dad wrote a book called Pollution and the Death of Man, and he was an evangelical leader, but this was before he got into the anti-abortion movement, and then got both branded and also kind of incited and induced into taking a leadership position in in part of a religious rite that actually he didn't sign on to a great deal of. And one of his last books before everything turned political was Pollution and the Death of Man. He was talking about this stuff before most of his secular counterparts were as well. I'm curious because you've got this book, Creation Crisis, Preaching Ecology, Theology, and the Pulpit. I kind of get the title, but I don't get the pulpit part. And so I want you to unpack that. Also, just tell us what's in the book and how it fits in with what we're talking about. Because, of course, a lot of the folks we've been talking about in the MAGA movement are overtly anti-environmental, deniers. So there's that connection to our previous part of the discussion. So I'm not just pulling this out of a hat, but I want you to unpack the title a little bit and tell us a little more about that book.
Yeah. I have been interested, as I said, in environmental issues pretty much since the beginning of my ministry. And in my first congregation, I started an ecology ministry. And when I knew that I wanted to go back and get my PhD in homiletics, my interest was to develop an ecological homiletic. Like, how do you help pastors talk about environmental issues that have become so politicized, when in fact Scripture speaks about care of creation all throughout? I mean, it's huge. And so I spent my dissertation work that time figuring out how to help pastors think of a method and a model for talking about this, introducing it. I use the metaphor of a tree. So you have to be rooted in biblical and theological ideas, and you want to be flowering. So, just introducing the ideas and getting people talking about it. So pollinating, like getting people engaged and thinking about how is care of creation part of our faith, part of our vocation. Thinking about leafing, how do we convert the energy into something that is substantive? So how can we engage putting our faith into action in our local community to protect land, water, public health? And then fruiting, how can we help other congregations learn how to do this? So the reason I think the pulpit is so important is because there have been studies that show that when congregants are in churches where pastors talk about climate as an issue of faith, they're more likely to believe that, one, climate change exists, and two, there's something that we should do about it because of our moral and ethical obligation. And then in my own research, I did a survey of about 1,000 pastors in 2017 and asked about how they're dealing with social issues such as environmental issues, and then did another survey wave in 2021. And in 2017, I found that environmental issues were among the lowest priorities for preachers at that time. But here's the really interesting thing. In 2021, it got into the top 6. So that tells me there has been a shift in a very short period of time where people are realizing, wow, this isn't political. This is happening in my own backyard. I mean, you look at what's happening with Hurricane Ian and what happened where I live in Kentucky. All of the flooding and the droughts and the fires. Like, it's no longer theoretical. You can't ignore this anymore.
Well, so and the 500-year events becoming 100-year, then 50-year, then 5-year events.
Yeah,
on fires,
exactly.
floods, and everything else. So
exactly. So what I'm finding is that preachers and congregations are hungry for resources to think about how we do this work within a faith context.
Well, sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead. I'm done.
Oh, hey, I'm so interested in what you're saying. I've forgotten we're doing a podcast and I don't want to interrupt you. So I just jump in as if we're at a bar having a drink together now. Like tapping you on the shoulder saying, yeah, but have you thought of this? So forgive me jumping in. I try not to interrupt. An aspect that I think comes out of the pulpit part, and I'm not saying you address this in your book, but I'm interested in your views on this because you've been a pastor, you're a wife, you're a mother, you're in a creative family, you have an investment in the future, as I do with my 3 grown children and 5 grandchildren. One thing that I find difficult as just as a human being, forget the issues, but also thinking of it from a pastoral point of view, that you're supposed to be helping people negotiate and not lie to them, feel good, but help them negotiate their own feelings. I think there's a good sense out there that my producer Ernie and I talk about sometimes as well, of a sort of a despair of the direction things are going. Forget big things. Let's just talk about the environment. I think there's a very credible argument that can be made now from a science-based point of view, not apocalyptic, but that we are presiding over the first steps of our own extinction as a race. That there's a real possibility that lots of stuff we're doing is now irreversible, and with a little bad luck down the road, we're going to, there may be a few of us left here and there, but we are really doing some catastrophic things to ourselves and to our planet. From a pastoral point of view, you must encounter people who feel that. And also, to do anything positive, to try to work with folks who have not necessarily given up, but really feel a sense of apocalyptic desperation, not theology-based, but science-based. How do you address that? And the last point on that is that, when you know some scientists who work in this area, I do know some, and I read some other things, but you do hear again and again, hey, listen, we don't want people to give up, so we don't actually give them the numbers as bad as we're seeing them. We try to moderate them and say, well, we can still get the percentage of greenhouse gases down. There's still a chance, when actually a lot of this now, the die is cast. So from a pastoral point of view, informed by the fact that you're a mother and a caregiver, where are we at when it comes to me and Nora, who already is learning things in school about what's happening to our environment? She's 8. And what do I tell her or myself about the fact that we are now one of the first generations in human existence to actually have the evidence that we may be presiding over our own destruction? Not necessarily in my lifetime or yours, but much closer than was formerly thought possible. And again, this doesn't tie in very well with the Christian vision of the loving God and everything will turn out and Jesus is in charge. None of which I believe, by the way. I'm at a very different place, quote unquote, theologically than you are, but we're on the same page on so many things. But as a pastor, how are you dealing with that?
That is something that my co-editor, Margaret Bullitt-Jonas, and I really wrestled with for the book that we put together called Rooted and Rising, Voices of Courage in a Time of Climate Crisis. And we asked 21 religious environmental activists the exact question that you just beautifully described. The way I asked
what did they tell you, and what is your view, or did you hear something you agreed with you hadn't thought of before?
Yeah, I call it the dark night of the green soul. How do you deal with the dark night of the green soul? These people have been doing this work, some of them for decades, and it's not getting better, it's getting worse. So how do you sustain yourself? How do you get out of bed in the morning knowing that there will be more and more bad news? And exactly what you said, that we are heading towards what I would call the Good Friday of this planet, where we are engaging in an eco-crucifixion, is what I call it.
Right.
So, and I have to say, eco-grief is real. Green depression is real. And even if people can't articulate it in that way, you can see it manifesting itself in the number of people who are dealing with mental health issues. You can see it in the media that we consume that is so apocalyptic. Even our young people, they're watching things like Hunger Games and Blade Runner and like all of these climate dystopian things. And so there is something, I think, that the human species recognizes on some level the truth of what you're saying.
Yeah.
And so we have some choices that we're going to have to make. And there's a great book that has been very helpful for me by Margaret Wheatley called Who Do We Choose to Be? And we have to be really intentional about how we're going to spend this time that we have left, and with the species that still remain. What are we going to cocoon ourselves in things that are going to anesthetize the pain, we may need to do that for a while. I mean, there are times when I just have to zone out and, go watch something that makes me feel better. But because I'm a person of faith,
Mhm.
and because I'm a Christian, I believe in going to the foot of the cross. That's where you're going to find Jesus. That's where you're going to find the crucified God. And so I think it's very important that we engage in this work, if for no other reason than to cultivate the relationships that are needed for whatever we're going to have to go through.
Mm.
So I believe very strongly in community building. I think I have to say I was very involved in the anti-fracking movement in Pennsylvania when I was still there. And I made friends and connections with both, religious, non-religious, scientific, people from all different walks of life that I never would have made had I not engaged this work. And
Mm.
that I do this because I'm locking arms with people who are also on the front lines doing this. And so I feel that solidarity, that bond, that they're out there doing this work. I'm their friend, I'm their mother, I'm their wife, I'm their colleague, and I'm going to keep doing this work even if there's, I mean, we are heading towards ecological disaster. And so we're going to have to figure out, how are we going to protect the most vulnerable in the ways that we can? How are we going to build relationship? How are we going to build community?
Mm.
And the other thing I will say is the people who are doing this work, I do believe are putting like a message in a bottle for the holy remnant that is left to be able to look at and say, okay, there were some people who understood
Mm.
what it means to live in cooperation with nature. Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, where she draws on indigenous wisdom
Mm.
and puts a different vision for how we can live together with the plants, with the
Yeah.
natural world. That's inspiring to me. And are things in upheaval? Absolutely. We are in it right now. It's not in the future. It's happening right now.
Mm.
And so we need to be doing this work as much as possible for as long as possible, so that we can, I mean, for me, it's a matter of integrity that I have to be able to look at my kids and say, honey, I did the best I could, as much as I could, for as long as I could.
Speaking of books, I read a book a little while ago by Elizabeth Marshall Thomas, whose father founded Raytheon, and he took her when she was 19 and her brother, I think, was 22, to Africa for 3 years, and they lived with the San people, not sand, but San, in the Kalahari Desert in the 1950s, before these folks were completely destroyed by the apartheid regime in South Africa that then took over Namibia, where they lived in the Kalahari. And it really changed the way I see things, because first of all, they were a hunter-gatherer society that had lived in harmony with their environment. And I'm not making this number up, provably for 80, not 80,000 years.
Wow.
80. Okay.
Yeah.
So they had been in that area since actually the transitional period of evolution to Homo sapien. So this is the real way. And the book's called The Old Way by Elizabeth Thomas Marshall. And it's probably the best book I've ever read in a nonfiction book, in terms of just laying out something that really corrected my thinking. And that is, whether it's patriarchal domination of tribe and people or disharmony with the environment, the oldest way of all did not have these modern diseases. These were not perfect human beings, but everything we think is traditional in terms of male-female relationships, in terms of the rape of the environment, the survival of the fittest, was not so with these folks. And it's why they survived so long. And what's interesting is there's a field of research that's been very much in the fore in the last 20 years, and that is changing the idea of the survival of the fittest to the survival of the friendliest, those who cooperate.
Yes, right.
So anyway, that's a roundabout way to give a big plug to her book. It's been out a long time, but I don't think there's anything better when it comes to balance with life and nature. And that's not even the purpose of the book. That's just reading what happened. And it's a tremendous piece of research. And she quotes her anthropologist mother as well, who was there with them, which brings up a kind of a point that ties back into you as a human, me as a human, and has a lot to do with what we're talking about. It seems to me that one of our problems is we have defined people by their position in career money-making in a capitalist system rather than by the quality of their human existence.
Right.
So if I was talking to your children, not to you, and they were having a cup of coffee with me out on the porch and saying, hey, you're 70 years old, what have you learned? It would be that, most of my quote career achievement really is not something I ever think about. What I think about is my granddaughter, Nora, how much I love my wife. I'm glad I fell in love. I'm glad we had children. I'm glad that I made a vote of confidence for the future. And the career basically is bullshit. You earn money and it's interesting, but please, 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 I would tell your kids, and you can tell them for me, do not believe this crap that says doing the big fancy cool thing is what you should be about. You want to do the things which put you in the closest harmonious touch with other human beings and relationships, whether you're gay, straight, non-binary, trans, doesn't matter. The point is, do you value the relationships in your life more than you value how you're defined by career? And I think part of the poison that has destroyed our planet is defining everything by the amount we earn and our career title. And it's a disease. And it's the lack of those human values. And by the way, just to go back to Elizabeth Thomas Marshall's book, Marshall Thomas's book, the Sand people weren't like that. Everything for them was the relationship you had with the rest of your family and group, not because it was a nice Christian thing to do. They'd never heard about Jesus or anything like that, but because that was the only way to survive in the harsh climate. If you were not a sharer, giver, participator, honest, caring, loving person, you were dead. Not killed by the tribe, but your group would not survive. So that's sort of a little bit of a sermon, but I want your reaction to it. And I think that'll be a good place. I'll let you just pitch it now. What do you think of what I've been preaching to you, preacher?
Yeah, well, what I hear you saying, and as you're talking about it, like what you would say to my kids.
Yeah, or my kids.
Yeah, well, just any kid. So I can't help but think about my own kids, and I have to say, I'm really proud of the choices that my daughter has made so far in terms of what she's pursuing in college. She's not going after an economics degree. She's not going after, like music and communication. Like, wow, that's it. And I have a feeling that my son loves drumming and marching band and music and the relationships that enables. And I'm pretty sure he's going to go into that. So the arts, like, what does that, he's not going to make a lot of money and it's going to be a world of pain for him. Because he's seen what happens with his, it is not easy work, but you feel like, this is what I love and I'm not in it. The money just means nothing. And you need enough to be able to survive. And we could have a whole conversation about how capitalism just is a killer of that. But I would have to say that, in terms of my own parenting, and the values that I've tried to instill and the conversations that we have, that I think we've done okay. And my husband and I think we've done okay. And no one can say that about, I can't judge somebody else's raising of their kids. Like, that is a very personal thing, but I feel like integrity is really important to me. I'm an Enneagram 1, I'm about, trying to do the best thing for, the planet and people. And I think about the ripple effect that hopefully my kids will make, and my students, my teaching and my writing, like I'm all about that. So what, I want to be able to look back and say, I tried to contribute to the healing of the earth and the healing of the human community in the best way that I could.
What are you teaching specifically? What's the subject? What's your course called, or courses?
Well, I teach preaching and worship. I'm an associate professor of preaching and worship. So I teach all kinds of, just introduction to preaching. I teach preaching about environmental issues and preaching in the purple zone, and I teach introduction to worship, all of that.
Having given you this little sermon, this book of mine that came out recently, Fall in Love, Have Children, Stay Put, Save the Planet, Be Happy. That's the title.
I love it. I love it.
And I had a big poster of it behind me, but I took it down because basically when I talk to you or to other people, I don't want it to be about pitching my book specifically, but it fits in with our discussion because obviously, if you're putting love of other people ahead of profiting off them, then your children are not just your biological children, it's every connection you have because you are in a caregiving position over people. So it's not even specific to get married or anything like that. Stay put rather than moving around with that huge footprint. Save the planet, which comes from staying put and lowering your sights on an economic agenda, and then be happy. Maybe was the wrong word. I should have probably said find joy because happy is a different sort of thing. But you might want to take a look. Now run through again the titles of books that are especially apropos to what we've just been talking about. We've talked about Creation Crisis, Preaching, Ecology, Theology, the Pulpit. We have talked about the Purple Zone. There are a number of other books you have. Let's just touch on them.
Yeah.
Throw some titles out.
Yeah. So then there's Rooted and Rising, Voices of Courage in a Time of Climate Crisis. Right. A collection of essays of people, asking these very questions. Sure. And then I did a little Lenten devotional that is a creation-based Lenten devotional called For the Beauty of the Earth. Then Apocalypse When, which is how to read and preach apocalyptic texts in Scripture. And then my newest book that's coming out, hopefully in January, co-written with my colleagues, Jerry Sumney and Emily Askew, is An Introduction to Preaching. It's a preaching textbook. Excellent.
And of those books, in terms of the range of our discussion today, and we've touched on a lot, which one or two would you say people who have listened to this podcast who want to go further and looking at your ideas might want to start with? And of course, we're going to put links to all of them up.
It depends on who you are. So if you're a clergy person, Creation Crisis preaching is really helpful. So is preaching in the Purple Zone, but that also can be used for lay people in the church. Rooted and Rising is more for a general audience and can be used in an interfaith setting. And For the Beauty of the Earth, a Lenten devotional, that can be done by anyone. Apocalypse When, anybody who is thinking about how to preach apocalyptic texts, so that would be clergy, but also people who are curious about how do we think about this. Even if you're a layperson, if you're looking for ways to deconstruct and reconstruct how we think about those, that also is a good book.
Okay, well, listen, this has really been a pleasure, Leah. We will put links up to everything. Again, this is Frank Schaeffer. This is my podcast, In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. Ernie Gregg is my producer. We have been talking to Leah all this time, who is the author of all the books that we're going to have listed and links to. This, as I said before, terminates the Facebook Live part. And then now the recording of this will go up on Facebook and YouTube. And then as my podcast will be released everywhere we release podcasts, and lots of other people do too. So anything you want to finish with, Leah, that I didn't touch on? You're saying, oh, gee, I wish you'd asked me this.
No, Frank, I really appreciate your questions. And I have really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you for being willing to ask the tough questions and have these conversations, because this is the kind of real talk we need right now.
Good. Well, I really appreciate you. And every time I get on with somebody I've never met, Ernie met you somewhere and said, she's really a great person. You're going to love this. I did love it. You're a really great person. I feel like I've made a good friend here. So you're lovely. Your students are lucky. Your family's lucky. The school you work at is lucky. And it's my good fortune to meet you today. So thank you so much. And
thank you.
Take care of yourself. And I hope we talk again.
Me too. Bye-bye now.
Take care. Bye-bye.